In today's Double Cape edition, we are talking about the raid. In the past few days, there has been some interesting discussion about the situation when it comes to raiding, in particular when it comes to Mythic Raiding, the difficulty level of Mythic Raiding, the expected amount of effort and time that you have to spend to get through and progress through Mythic Raiding, the current level of difficulty of bosses, the amount of wipes required for different bosses, the age-old question of whether or not it's the right way to go through when it comes to Blizzard developing the difficulty of the bosses for a select few of 100 or so players for the race to world first, and then trickle down the difficulty with nerfs so that the bosses become more accessible for everyone else, as well as a few other compounding problems like mechanics getting more complicated, requiring more help of add-ons and much more prep time with things like spreadsheets, having to take screenshots of the entire room, trying to place your players in precise positions for certain mechanics, etc, etc. So, first thing, you do have it's not complete fake news, but some of it definitely is. You often see mentioned whenever someone wants to complain about the state of raiding, how, Mythic Raiding is failing, there are fewer and fewer players, there are fewer and fewer guilds, oh yeah, my guild quit too, Mythic Raiding has gotten too hard. Well, at least numbers wise, this is not really supported that much. If you look at this is the last progression in the tiers for the past basically 7 years, in the first 4 months of a tier, and you can see that the number of kills of the last boss in Mythic with Neverbar Palace this season are not particularly out of line with other tiers. They are similar to the kills of Amir Jasil, they are similar to the kills of Castelnatria, even of things like Nyalota or things like Battle of the Zarlor. So we're not talking about something completely out of the ordinary, even when it comes to the completion rate. So the percentage of guilds who killed at least the first boss in Mythic, who actually ended up then clearing the entire raid, so getting cutting edge, it's actually, again, on the upper half of percentages when it comes to Mythic Raiding in this expansion. And even more, it was actually the highest ever in Dragonflight. So even just a few months ago, it was still very high and very healthy. Even when you go down and look at the actual wipes, for example, on average in your progression in the raid, the past expansion in particular was actually the least hard we had on record. Yeah, you might have gotten your memory scrambled up a bit by the difficulty of Ferak plus Tindral together, but even with that, the amount of wipes on average, even by world first guild standards, was actually lower than the average wipes required for all previous raid tiers in general, all the way back to Warlords. Now, admittedly, of course, Neverbar Palace was on the harder side. It breached the 1000 wipe count even for the number 1 guild in the world, and an average of 125 wipes required per boss, which became the second highest, only beaten by Tomb of Sargeras, right? So it was still quite high. So we are not trying to pass Neverbar Palace as an easy raid, but overall, with all the numbers combined, it's not terrible, and also the amount of participation of guilds is still quite good when it comes to Mythic Raiding. However, how is it then that despite the participation of the guilds being kind of okay, the amount of wipes not even being that much out of the ordinary, why is it that now you have a much more sour taste in your mouth when going through these bosses or experiencing these bosses compared to before? Even going through, for example, not necessarily Neverbar Palace, but even Amir Jasil just a few months ago, you still had plenty of players somewhat disappointed or disgruntled with the difficulty of the raid. Now, a lot of this, of course, has to do with the concentration of the difficulty on a few bosses. Because, of course, if you are to make a raid with 10 bosses, where one raid has every boss on average requiring 50 pulls, for a total of 500 or so pulls required to clear the entire raid. And then the next raid, you make the first 8 bosses require 1 pull, 1 shot, complete jokes, and then the last 2 bosses requiring almost 250 pulls each. Of course, even though both raids technically took just about the same amount of wipes, the same amount of attempts to clear, one of them will be remembered to be more tough and difficult because two of the bosses were much harder than average. You just completely forget the loot pinata bosses, the early easy bosses, and only remember the ones that were properly difficult, like we had in the past two raid tiers. We had, even for top guilds, we had 300 wipes for Nexus Princess, you had 400 for Ansurek, you had 400 and 340 for Tindral and for Farak, which were on the very high end. You know, to get similar bosses in terms of wipes in the previous expansions, you have to go back to Halondrus in Sepulchre, and then before then, if you exclude Crucible, which was only two bosses, you have to go all the way back down to Tomb of Sargeras, the last two bosses of Tomb of Sargeras. So from Legion to basically now, you only had three other bosses to have this kind of 350 plus pulls being required. Instead now, in just the past two raid tiers, Amir Jasil and Nerobar Palace, you just got four of them. So there's been that, which has soured some players' experience when it comes to progression. Then you have the other part, which is complained very often, which is the sort of part-time job requirements in becoming a raider, especially an officer or a raid leader, anyone that has any kind of responsibility when it comes to coming up with cooldowns, cooldown placements, when it comes to healers, when it comes to things like mobility abilities, where to place them in the fight. You have to start looking at logs, at VODs and replays to try to see what other guilds are doing, and then you have to start looking into weak auras as well as custom weak auras. You have to use a note in your ERT to match with your weak aura that is going to warn players or give them some kind of guides to do certain mechanics, and that requires setup, requires prep time, all outside, of course, of the actual game. Not to mention other things like having to have some kind of perhaps WoW audit to be able to give out loot distribution properly, to make sure you're getting the max value out of the loot from your boss skills, etc, etc. So when you take all of these things combined, of course, it gets a bit more daunting to get into something like Mythic Raiding, even though now it seems pretty chill, because many players right now, for example, are more than fine just hopping into the raid in a pug and killing the first four bosses. You know, even now, you are still able to get 2 vault options from Mythic Raiding just with pugs, which is something that was not really doable for practically ever when Mythic Raiding was a thing. Either because, number one, the vault wasn't there, so you weren't even going to do that, or pugging Mythic bosses wasn't that much of a thing, and then even when the vault was introduced all the way back in Shadowlands, it still wasn't that much of a thing. In Dragonflight, it started to become a more common feature of having pugs killing bosses, and now it's much more normal in Nerobar Palace. So you can say that in a way Mythic Raiding has gotten more accessible simply because of this deal of making the early bosses much easier. However, this has often also been a point of contention for many players. What's the point in making these early bosses so undertuned? You know, what if, for example, if we look at the difficulty level even of just the past couple of raids, what if we took 200 of the wipes required for Ansurek and 150 of the wipes required for Nexus Princess, so 350 wipes total, and we spread them for the first 4 raid bosses in Nerobar Palace. So about 85 wipes each. So now, instead of having a raid which progressed in terms of wipes required with 1111, 120, 304, 171 and 404, you would have a new raid which progressed like 85 wipes, and then 85, 85, 85, 120, 150, 170, 200. Suddenly, now it's much more smooth. Suddenly now your progress is also much more visible, because again, another positive of spreading the difficulty across multiple bosses is that you get to see your checkpoints, you know, the check marks through the progression of the raid much more visibly. If instead of having a single boss requiring 600 pulls, you had 3 different bosses requiring 200 pulls, or 6 different bosses requiring 100 pulls each, then you will be able to see to visibly see and be, of course, happy with and satisfied with your progress much more visibly, because now instead the only benefit you have of having a 400 wipe boss is whenever you manage to go to a different phase. Hey guys, yes, we just had our 257th wipe, but we made it to phase 3. That's kind of the end of the night. Positive feeling for the raid. We broke into P3. That's kind of the feeling you have when you were fighting such hard and long bosses like Ansorek or Nexus Princess or Farak or Tindral, etc, right? The bad thing of this, of course, would be that now you would somewhat take away the pagging ability from other players. Because if instead of making the first 4 bosses some one-shot level bosses, you gave them an 80 wipes average kind of boss difficulty, then they won't really be able to be pugged. Or it would take you several more weeks or months to have pugs starting to deal with a boss that on average on progress took 80 wipes. Maybe you would have to wait 3 months or 4 months before that 80 wipe boss could be pugged in like 10 wipes maybe, right? But definitely not nearly as easy as we have now. Even as we had in a Mirjasil or a Berus or Volt, you could just stroll in and kill the first few bosses quite easily, even in pugs, right? That, unfortunately, is a byproduct of pushing all of the wipes, all of the difficulty of the raid towards the latter bosses. So there would have to be this compromise. Either you are okay with the early bosses being loot pinatas, so you can get pugs to kill them, you can log into your alts and kill those early bosses more easily, but the downside is that now the latter bosses are more loaded with difficulty. Or you can spread the difficulty, you can make the latter bosses not require 400 or 500 wipes, but require only 200, but that's because you then also spread those wipes early on. You made 50 wipe bosses and 60 wipe bosses or 70 wipe bosses much earlier on, which would make, of course, the pug experience worse when it comes to mythic difficulty. That is sort of something that can divide the player base, the ones that are okay with this, the raiders that actually want to have more spread difficulty when they want to progress, and then the ones who are not that much into raiding, much more into getting free loot, so having their early bosses no longer be nearly as easy would directly impact their ability to pug those bosses much more easily. That can also be a pretty thorny subject for the player base in the way it would be divided in. The other point about the mythic difficulty right now is not just the difficulty, but of course the mechanics. One of the thorny subjects again on the difficulty of the Mythic Raiding progression was the fact that we have been moving away from the system of difficult mechanics, yes, however, these difficult mechanics were assignable to 1 to 2, possibly even 5 or 6 players. So the raid leader was able to do, okay, I can just tell the players I trust more, the players I think are better, right, more reliable, or they simply are used to be handling these mechanics better, and I just give them the mechanic, right, easy. So we have a lower chance to fail. Now though, progressively from possibly even BFA, definitely into Shadowlands and then Dragonflight and the War Within, we have been getting more and more mechanics where instead they are first of all randomized, which means the raid leader cannot try to hide their weakest players behind the good ones. Instead now every mechanic is randomized, meaning you don't get to choose who gets to do the mechanic. And then number 2, the mechanics are generally hitting way more members of your raid. Sometimes they even hit everyone in your raid. Think about Nexus Princess. Nexus Princess has all of the intermissions, which during progress you have to do all 3 of them, the 2 normal ones and then the last one, which was until you either killed the boss or died. Those intermissions were of course for everyone. Everyone had to dodge, everyone had to take a bunch of damage from the lines, everyone had to dodge other players' lines and try not to get 2-tapped by 2 lines at the same time. So this was a global effort in the intermission. And then in the normal phase, you also had, first of all, of course, the dodging of the lines and dodging of the orbs, which was for everyone. And then you had the targeting of Queensbane and targeting of assassination, which was again for everyone, minus the tanks. So Nexus Princess was that kind of a nasty fight where you were completely unable to mask, to protect, and to try to hide your weakest players. So that was a classic example of your raid truly being weighted, being valued by the value of your weakest member, because everyone needed to do all of the mechanics. There are other examples of this, like pass/fail mechanics, like either all of your raid does this properly, or 10 or so players in your raid do this properly, or you all die. You have, for example, the P2 of Ansurek, where you're split into two groups and you have to deal with the dispel of the mechanic going to the portal. If you don't do it in time, you just blow up and kill everyone. In Silken Court, of course, you're again split. You cannot touch each other, and you have to properly soak the orbs, because, again, back before it was massively nerfed, if you were missing one, but definitely if you were missing two orbs, then everyone would just blow up and explode. So even the mistake of a single player forgetting his soak was possibly going to cause a wipe for everyone. You can say the same for things like Brute Twister. Again, you can't mask your weak players because the egg breaking was completely random. You couldn't assign egg breaking. Back if we were fighting in like Cataclysm or maybe Mists or maybe even Legion, early Legion, the mechanic of the egg breaking would have been Brute Twister dropping a bunch of orbs, and then players who walked on the orbs would then be able to break the eggs. In that case, the raid leader would have been able to assign players he wanted to go and break the eggs. Instead, now it's completely RNG. So you need to have each player be able to recognize the egg they are supposed to go to, the egg they are supposed to break, and if they don't, very likely, very often, it's going to be a wipe for your group, right? So they've also gotten progressively throughout the tiers even more of these mechanics that if even just one player messes up, everyone dies. Okay, Razaget, you had the polar mechanic where if one goes the wrong way, the entire raid blows up, etc, etc. Things like Aberus. In Aberus, you had Neltarion with players with the debuff on the heart debuff needed to go to the right place, otherwise it would just blow up the entire raid, clipping them with his huge circle. So there are just many more of these mechanics that must be handled practically randomly, and they test the entire raid, because even just failing for a single player causes the death of the entire raid. Now, this doesn't mean that the targetable mechanics are gone, right? Mechanics like Farak in Amir Josil, where you can assign players to pick up the orbs, they can assign players to manage those orbs and put all of the responsibility on them, right? Those kinds of mechanics are still there. I mean, even just on Queen. In Mythic Queen, you have the essences. You can still assign players you trust to deal with the essences, right? So those mechanics are still there. The problem is that on top of those mechanics, now you have even more mechanics where failure very often means everyone dying. Whereas back then, failure might have meant a single player dying, which could have been combat rest. Other times it could have been failure meant taking more damage, which meant you could have still survived, you could have still adapted, you could have still dropped an earlier healing cooldown to try to go through it, and then think about the problem this causes later on, but at least you survive. Instead now, these kind of failing mechanics kind of just mean death more often, which makes it, again, even more frustrating to wipe. Because again, if you squish the difficulty of the wipes all towards the bosses at the very end, if you make the early bosses some kind of loot pinata getting one shot, and then you just make some 2+, 3+, 100 wipe bosses at the very end, having to go through those bosses or just one minor mistake of one player that was targeted randomly causes the death of everyone, it creates more frustration in the players progressing overall, because they, first of all, they feel like they themselves are not really contributing to the progress of the fight, because every time the mechanic comes, you're like, oh god, let's hope it goes to the right players and we actually get to do this, so we get to see phase 2 before the end of tonight. Or maybe, oh god, the one who has already failed the mechanic 3 times got the mechanic again. Let's hope at least this time he does it, so we can maybe get to see P2 tonight, right? That type of feeling, that doesn't feel too good for a player. And then you have the other part, which is of course the fact that with raid bosses being so difficult and requiring so many wipes, this can put you into these annoying situations, like we just made the example of Mythic Ansurek and the essence mechanic in the last phase. So you had to spend 150 wipes in P1. And then you have to spend 100 more wipes in P2, learning all of the movements, all of the dispelling and the moving to the portals, dodging the beams while you get pulled in by the mobs. You get to finally into P3, and now you have a personalized mechanic for 5 to 6 players who need to learn when to pick the essence, how to find their correct essence compared to the ones of another player, where it's going to be dropped, and if they fail, they wipe, because the essence touching the ring coming in towards the portal kills everyone. So you put a mechanic that can wipe the entire raid like 7 minutes, 8 minutes into the fight. You know, that also makes it more daunting to progress, because similar to other debacles, if you remember, things like Sanctum, even though Sanctum as a raid was very undertuned, it was very simple throughout all of its progress, besides two major bumps, Painsmith and Sylvanas. Sylvanas was like a 12-13 minute fight. It was one of those rare double bloodlust kind of fights, and Sylvanas had one of the more intricate positioning and movement requirements in the very last phase, in the very narrow square of room you had in the last phase, which requires some getting used to, which meant you had to go through 10 minutes of fighting before even having a chance to actually progress in the fight. And then all it took was one player say, "Oops, I forgot," and you all die. And then you just have to go back and go again 10 minutes to even hope to see any progress. That's the other downside of having bossing requiring so many wipes. If instead you had bosses with difficulty more spread throughout the raid, so that boss only required 200 pulls, 200 wipes, so presumably going through P1, P2, P3 is not going to take you 150, 150 and 150 wipes. It's going to take you 60, 60, 60, so it's going to be much faster to get there. It's going to feel like you're progressing faster. And this can be felt on multiple bosses, because as I said, if you brought up all of these early loot pinata one-shot bosses to be some 60 to 80 wipe bosses, so the difficulty range of something like Smolderon, the difficulty range of something between Smolderon and like Kurog, somewhere around there, all bosses though, not just the latter ones, then you would also have a better feel for progression, a better feel for going boss by boss, instead of saying tonight we get to P1, 2 weeks from now maybe we're done getting through P2, and then 500 wipes in total we get to kill the boss. I feel like that is also something that makes raiding feel more stale. When it comes to Mythic, if you just dump all of the difficulty in the last few bosses, not only does it feel bad for the player base because they have to just kill the same boss over and over and the other bosses become kind of useless, it also feels bad for players who want to just feel like they are progressing beyond just knowing their progression based on their lowest percentage wipe on the boss, which is not nearly as good as knowing their progression by having killed 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bosses, because the first 4 bosses died in week 1 because they were so simple, right? That's another problem. Then of course you can go back to mentioning the problem of the race to world first, the whole deal around making the bosses about this kind of guild. Many players at this point have given up caring. They are simply wishing that Blizzard didn't even bother balancing every raid around these guilds. Because as I mentioned, if we actually made the raid with the, basically imagine all 8 bosses in the raid requiring on average 100 pulls for your average guild. Even your average like top 50 guild, 100 pulls. That would mean that for the top guilds, all those bosses would die in 50 to 60 wipes. And the race to world first would be done in 2 nights. And that was it, right? So that's the other problem that maybe even Blizzard might be fearing of making every tier, which is going to last for 6 months, not have as much hype and as much viewership, for example, drawn towards this race, because the bosses are being made for normies, for the average player base. But you know, if it's made for the average player base, players are not gonna care too much to go on stream and see guild number 1 be on pool 562 of a certain boss, because instead on pool 92 the boss was already dead, right? That's the other issue we have when it comes to raiding. However, this rant at this point was long enough. we have been talking about this issue when it comes to raiding. We have also talked for over 20 minutes without giving any kind of solution, without giving any kind of possible solution to the problem, besides the years old just spread the difficulty throughout all bosses. You know, screw players who want to pug and wanted their easy 4 mythic boss kills for their 2 vault options. If this means that all of the early bosses must be loot pinatas and then all of the latter bosses are overloaded with difficulty, then no. I can kiss goodbye to my alts clearing these bosses again if it means the entire progression of the mythic difficulty is more smooth and more balanced. So this was the point for today, just a random rambling around the current situation when it comes to mythic difficulty, as we start also getting closer to the PTR releases and testing of the raid bosses of next season. For today though, on the beginning of this new week, on this Monday, we can now leave each other again. So we're starting with the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone who has been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I'm not gonna lie, double cape on your head, even if it's cold outside, kind of gets a bit too warm.